an hour are over 20 years old. 57% of single working parents make less than $15 an hour. The same folks that want to force women to bring pregnancies to term are fighting tooth and nail to prevent them from getting raises, all while complaining about their own taxes. Meanwhile, in Florida, where a Trump-supporting majority also voted in favor of a $15 minimum wage, Governor Ron DeSantis has been fighting to subvert the democratic will of the people, saying, now is not the time. Well, when is the time, DeSantis? Well, you've been wasting time establishing National Victims of Communism Day. The residents of your state have been falling victim to the ravages of capitalism. There's a housing crisis in Florida, but all DeSantis can do is talk culture war. A local Palm Beach reporter wrote that there was a 22% rise in home prices last year, which brought the median cost of a home to nearly $500,000. But he wrote, quote, you never know it by the actions of state lawmakers who wrapped up their legislative session recently. Instead, they've mostly functioned as campaign operatives for Governor Ron DeSantis, fighting imaginary gay indoctrination in schools and fictitious Antifa hordes in the street, while supporting rewrites of history to make white students feel more comfortable about slavery. He goes on to write that about 1 in 5 workers in Florida are employed in 10 poverty wage jobs. Retail salesperson, food preparation, cashiers, waiters or waitresses, office clerks, laborers, stock clerks, janitors, restaurant cooks, and nursing assistants. These are the people real populists should be fighting for. After all, no one can keep the rain off their families' backs with a CRT-free math book. While former OMB Director Russ Vought mocked the idea of spending money on housing, Americans, including Americans in red states, are the ones taking the hit. Housing costs are sky high as corporate investors gobble up real estate. In Miami, there's been an 18.8% increase in housing costs since last year. That's 22% in San Diego, 30.2% in Phoenix. Democrats are not immune from this type of mismanagement, but note, these are all red cities being underserved by their local conservative governments. And who is the culprit? Megacorp real estate companies have been exploiting the COVID crisis to kick out renters and jack up prices. Real estate tycoons have benefited to the tune of billions of dollars, you guessed it, in tax breaks. And for the first time in 20 years, the Chamber of Commerce was nudged out of the top lobbying spot by, guess who? The National Association of Realtors. And what do you think they're spending all that money on? Well, they will tell you. According to the National Association of Realtors' best practices for lobbyists, the top lobbying priority for the last 6 years has been ending the realty transfer tax. Yes, that is a small tax the municipality collects to fund affordable housing, public transit, sidewalks, parks, and schools whenever a property is sold. Despite huge profits and paying huge amounts in lobbying, cutting taxes at the cost of people who live in their buildings is this group's priority. It should come as no surprise at this point that megacorps don't want to pay their fair share, just like, apparently, David Asman. The real fight is not left-right, but top-down. Asman frames this segment around Biden, punching left instead of punching up. Biden is a problem. I do think he should pay his fair share, but it is important to identify the reason why he doesn't, so you don't fall in with some on the other side of the aisle who are just as bad or worse. Biden is a problem because he's bought by the same interests that motivate wealthy elites like Asman. Biden was the largest recipient of billionaire and corporate money in a crowded Democratic primary field. He is corrupt. And more often than not, he will bend to the will of the lobbyists who funded him over the people who elected him. It's important to recognize this isn't a partisan issue, or even a personal one. In fact, the National Association of Realtors' best practices makes clear that it is most effective when it is nonpartisan. As long as people keep falling for the DeSantis misdirection that tries to make an obscure law school academic discourse the enemy instead of his own failed housing policy, and the Democratic misdirection that privileges conversations about Trump, who hasn't been president in years, over its own failure to pass relief for struggling Americans, will get nowhere. And they know it. So, Robbie, I really wanted to talk about this today because it's not that I don't disagree with a lot of the cultural critiques, but it is so exhausting to see both sides falling into the trap where we talk about this nonstop and never talk about the real nitty-gritty economic stuff that's going down in states like Florida. Why aren't Democrats focusing less on CRT, frankly, as a rejoinder, as a way to push back against some of the Republican entrenchment there, and instead talk about how the people who live in the state are suffering. And they're suffering so much that even though they're conservative, they support this $15 minimum wage, which the Republican legislature down there has been fighting tooth or nail ever since they voted for it in 2020.
I mean, I have to confess, I'm not a huge fan of minimum wage policies in general, especially nationally, because $15 just, well, even within a state, it matters. There are a lot of places where that is woefully insufficient to survive on. There are some places where it's that gets you a lot more.
It gets you a lot more, but places where it's woefully insufficient to survive and have much higher minimum wages, like New York, even in Bessemer, Alabama, where that initial Amazon fight went down, that was an institution, that was a factory that was paying $15 an hour, which people were attracted to in the state, but was also a place with union activism, because even people in Alabama, a low-cost state, felt like that wasn't enough to live.
Right. I think, but the problem, the reason people struggle with that amount of money is because the cost of everything is cost disease. It's the cost of education, child care, health care, right now, food and gas and things like that. You know, that is an inflation problem. But you know, I look at so many of the sectors of things that have gotten so much more expensive as having had heavy government involvement and subsidization in, and I say, well, what are we doing wrong that it keeps getting more and more and more and more and more expensive to have basic education and health care when it, like other things that like TVs have not gotten more expensive. Products have not gotten more expensive.
Well, I point this to
Housing's gotten more expensive because we put artificial limits on how many freaking houses you can build.
Well, I don't know what you're talking about, artificial limits on how many houses we can build, when I just pointed to you the millions and millions of dollars that are being spent. The number one lobbying group in the country right now, the biggest spend is coming from these real estate companies that have bought up all of this real estate in the middle of the pandemic in order to kick renters out and drive up prices. There is not a housing crisis in the country insofar as, you know, empty rooms for people to rent. It's that they are being kept empty to artificially drive up prices. Is that kind of manipulation by big corporate interests not a concern?
But why would you say that that's manipulation when the local zoning commission saying, no, you can't build a building here, this little diner is historically preserved.
It's not an inventory
we need to knock
issue.
that down and build giant. It is an inventory issue.
It's not an inventory issue. There are more empty houses than there are homeless people in America. It's not an inventory issue. It's a cost issue where people are trying to squeeze out these enormous amount of profits, as I've just detailed.
The cost would go down if there were more units available.
Right, but there are sufficient units available for people to live in, and the fact that people aren't living them is only because they know that they can squeeze people out to make an inordinate amount of profit. These are incredibly profitable sectors, and what they're all saying is, we would rather screw over the population with the help of elected officials that are supposed to be looking out for us in order to turn marginally more profit, and at the same time you have all of these politicos doing their work for them, saying that the enemy of the people should be the government, not for the reason that the government isn't working for you, which is a good reason to be oppositional to the government, but because they are, you know, not paying enough in taxes. Joe Biden deserves a great deal of criticism. Ron DeSantis deserves a great deal of criticism. But what we should be asking is for, in my humble opinion, is for our elected officials to actually stand in between us and the enormous aggregations of corporate wealth and power that are trying to squeeze out the little people for more threat to establishment politics in America. Well, follow the money and you'll find out. According to an article published this week by 2016 Bernie Sanders campaign manager Jeff Weaver, a corporatist coup has been launched by a wide array of allied groups, including crypto speculators, the oil industry, pharmaceuticals, finance, and even Republicans. And who are they targeting? Populist progressive candidates fighting for higher wages, universal health care, climate reform, and criminal justice reform. I've noted on this program and elsewhere that a key difference between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party is that Republicans respect their base, Democrats loathe theirs. And now there's evidence that Democrats leverage more resources and are more effective at killing the only energy that exists on the left than they are at defeating Republican opponents. We saw how this went down in Ohio's 11th district, where super PACs like AIPAC and DMFI, the Democratic Majority for Israel, raised millions of dollars for attack ads against Nina Turner, ultimately damning both her runs. These groups not only launched ads that lied about her political record, they attempted to silence her by inaccurately smearing her as anti-Semitic. But the corporate interests didn't stop there. You might have heard that while Democrats rushed to make money off the leaked Dobbs opinion and exploit legitimate fears that the end of Roe v. Wade was afoot, Democratic leaders like Jim Clyburn were literally campaigning for anti-choice candidate Henry Cuellar in his district, despite the fact that he's neck and neck in a runoff with a pro-choice, progressive populist, Jessica Cisneros. She's right there, ready for support by the party who says they believe in choice and also likes to pretend they like to support women of color. Crypto speculator Sam Bankman-Fried spent some $10 million to promote an unknown name over a number of progressive candidates, making the race for Oregon's 6th congressional district the most expensive in the country. But even worse, that spin was amplified by the House Democratic Caucus, who threw an additional $1 million into the race as well. Corporate interests also tried to take down Pennsylvania progressive Summer Lee. As Akela Lacey reported in The Intercept, quote, the United Democracy Project, the political action committee for 8 in on the race, most of which went to messaging attacking Lee. But this time, it didn't work. Summer Lee won an astounding victory Tuesday night despite the millions of corporate dollars funding her opponent and smears that she was anti-Semitic too. The basis of those smears, by the way, she was pointing out how the phrase Israel has a right to defend itself had been used to justify atrocities against Palestinians. Defending yourself is fine, but defending yourself isn't the issue when you're attacking worshippers at Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is what Lee was responding to at the time of her tweets. But AIPAC's preoccupation isn't rhetorical precision. Its preoccupation is crushing populist progressive candidates that are actually unbought and are therefore able to fight for the agenda majorities of Americans across the aisle want, a living wage. It was a David and Goliath story, and at least when it came to Lee Fetterman, Charles Booker, and some others, David finally won. But here's what's really so bizarre. Even though these progressives won, in part because they were so known and respected in their communities that the smears just didn't stick, corporate media is already spinning these victories as a problem. Chris Wallace, formerly of Fox, now on CNN, hand-wrung about Fetterman's win, saying he's a risk for Democrats in a general election because he wants universal background checks and to legalize pot. 2 policies that are enormously popular.
I will say I have to disagree slightly with the previous panel, because while his authenticity and down-to-earthness, if there's such a phrase, played very well in the Democratic primary, you get to a general election, particularly if you end up with a moderate like Dave McCormick, there are a lot of things that the Republicans are going to have to work with in going after John Fetterman. This is a guy who is against limits on abortion. He's for universal background checks. He wants to end the filibuster. He wants to legalize pot.
Not to mention 88% of Pennsylvania voters support background checks, and a majority support the right to choose. This is what corporate media always does. Misrepresent what the people want, gaslighting us into thinking that what we really need is a do-nothing corporatist who maintains the status quo too many Americans are suffering under already. And what's really, really wild about all of this is that corporate Democrats and their media stooges regularly bash progressives as, quote, not real Democrats, all while their chosen candidates openly sabotage the Democratic Party agenda. In Oregon's 5th district, the Democratic Party's choice was Kurt Schrader, a man labeled the Joe Manchin of the House because of his ability to derail Biden's agenda. He played a key role in killing the drug pricing legislation built into the Build Back Better bill. Popular legislation that bipartisan majorities of Americans want because, we can't afford health care. Thankfully, he's losing to progressive Jamie McLeod Skinner, but not before he got millions of dollars in outside big pharma spending and a pro-Israel super PAC called Mainstream Democrats PAC. What a name. And not before he got a key endorsement from Joe Biden, the man whose agenda he killed. Make it make sense. In Biden's endorsement announcement, he said, "We don't always agree, but when it has mattered most, Kurt has been there for me, and in doing so, has helped pass much of my agenda into law." Whew. If this is what your friends look like, who needs enemies? Now, if you're wondering why progressives are doing so well, despite corporate Democrats and Republicans insisting like mean girls that nobody likes you, look to a new NBC News poll cited in a recent piece from The Lever. Nearly 2/3 of Democratic voters want a candidate who proposes larger-scale policies that cost more and might be harder to pass into law, but could bring major change on the issues of healthcare, climate change, the cost of college, and economic opportunity. People are over incrementalism. We are living in the world incrementalism has wrought. It's time for a change, and this rising populist movement is ready to deliver. The question is whether populist progressives can overcome the corporatists funding the Democratic Party and plutocratic super PACs to deliver for the people. So I was triggered into writing this, Robbie, when I saw that Joe Biden was endorsing the guy who derailed his own campaign, like, core part of his agenda, at the same time that progressives in my camp are constantly told that we're not real Democrats, as we run against Nina Turner that expressly said she's not a real Democrat, never being really specific about what that means, by the way, but just the vibes were, you're not on our team, you can't sit at our table, real mean girl stuff. And the very people who are et tu brute-ing you, stabbing you in the back, are not only off the hook, they're actively getting your endorsement in millions and millions of dollars in corporate campaign donations. And nobody talks about that as being in conflict with the values of the Democratic Party.
No, you're right. I've talked about this a lot with Ryan when he hosts. So I try never to make the mistake of thinking things that I think are right or are good policy are necessarily popular. Some of the things I think are good policy are popular. Many of them are not. And I think a lot of political actors fall into that category. And it's easy to see with the the fights between the so-called moderate or liberal Democratic wings and the progressive wings. Whereas moderate, even I can concede that moderate doesn't necessarily mean more popular. Many of the things progressives support, the policies are popular, depending on how they're framed. Now, some progressives, I think, get it like socialism is not popular. Just calling it socialism is not popular. The underlying policies might be popular.
Sure.
But yeah, Chris Wallace, not his best commentary. Pot legalization, incredibly popular. I mean, what better way to actually get people excited? Like even many Republicans support that policy now. So that was some tone deaf commentary.
Yeah, and you would not. I'm not surprised by that, given the tone of what the conversation that happened on these mainstream news channels, and also the guests they have on. I think it would be genuinely jarring for him if there was someone at the table who's just said, "What are you talking about? Of course, pot's popular."
Yeah.
And just
And as a single issue voter, I am a single issue voter. I will vote for the candidate who is most against COVID restrictions. Between Lamb and Fetterman, they were bringing...
Like, liberals are always coming for your stuff. I feel like every time I log on, there's another article about how Democrats are infringing on our freedoms. This week it's gas stoves. A few years ago it was hamburgers. Last year, wokeness claimed the sexiness from the green M&M. Heck, I'm old enough to remember when liberals allegedly ruined Christmas at Starbucks with those damn confounded red cups. But whether or not you're someone who needs to see, say, religious iconography on your latte, long legs on your candy, or a pilot light flickering in your kitchen, you probably recognize that none of these issues are core to the freedoms that matter the most to you. Your ability to keep a roof over your head, pay for health care, raise your family safely, and with the values and traditions you hold dear. Which is why it doesn't matter to me if the woke M&M or coffee cups make people angry. I get it. Change is hard. And I can't deny that flats don't flatter every anthropomorphized sweet snack. Frankly, I don't know that Little Debbie has the likes for sneakers. But what if I told you that while we're debating confectionary's footwear, state legislatures are passing laws that will dictate what you wear in your free time, that will constrain your choice to express yourself the way you want to? Now, we've talked a great deal about social media censorship, accounts being shadow banned or banned outright, entire stories like the Hunter Biden laptop story being wiped from the internet. What if I told you that there was a Texas law banning your ability to use certain social media sites entirely? We've talked a lot about the surveillance implications of Amazon home camera systems and how big tech companies so often turn your private information over to corrupt and untrustworthy police forces. But what if I told you that there's a Mississippi law being promulgated that would install cameras in rooms to record adults at work and school so that they can be monitored at will? And what if I told you that if your gender is ambiguous, say you're a short-haired woman partial to a pantsuit, that you'd have to submit to a DNA test under a new law to confirm that state documents conform to your gender assigned at birth, and that state workers that didn't force you to get a DNA test would be fined $1,500 for not complying with the law. What if I told you that after decades of First Amendment law being built on defending the right for adult magazines and videos to exist, that Louisiana passed a law that would require you to submit a state ID in order to view pornography? You can technically still see it, but who's keeping the list? I regret to inform you that this dystopian portrait is very much our current reality. Earlier this month, Idaho Republicans considered a bill that would ban public drag shows. Unlike other bills promulgated in other parts of the country, this bill isn't about banning children from drag shows. It simply bans men wearing women's clothes and vice versa. So much for any historically accurate productions of Shakespeare. Gender-bending Halloween costumes or even a fun Friday night for Rudy Giuliani.
That's Giuliani, mayor of New York, in drag.
You know, you're really beautiful.
The sketch was for a charity dinner, and it's pretty racy.
This may be the best of all. Oh, you dirty boy, you! Oh, oh!
Look what they're taking from us. Look, in all seriousness, this law harkens back to anti-cross-dressing laws from the 1960s, which limited how many articles of clothing from the opposite sex a person could wear. And like so many laws, it was invented to criminalize, punish, and fine ordinary citizens, restricting their core American freedoms. Dig a little deeper, and you'll find the Idaho law was drafted by a self-described Christian nationalist, Blaine Conzatti, whose explicit goal is to impose his specific brand of Christianity on all the diverse Christian and non-Christian citizens of Idaho. Conzatti cites Deuteronomy as a basis for this law, you know, the part of the Bible that says you can't wear wool and linen woven together. What's next? Are conservatives coming for your winter knits? Now, this law is not likely to pass constitutional muster, but as an op-ed in a local paper observed, it is likely to cost taxpayers plenty of money on a frivolous lawsuit to protect the citizenry's First Amendment rights. And where are the state Republicans in all of this? Well, this is a state where a few years ago they killed a bill that would give single mothers access to the federal child support system because they believed it meant Sharia law was going to be enforced. So, needless to say, not a ton of pushback from the local GOP. Things aren't looking much better a couple of states over in North Dakota, where Republicans are so concerned with how people choose to identify on state forms that anyone, including state employees, who wittingly or unwittingly use a pronoun other than the one assigned at birth on a form will be penalized to the tune of $1,500. Yet another instance, it seems, of government extracting fees from working people. Now, while the legislature is dreaming up new regulations and new fines, it's worth noting that North Dakota's poverty rate is 13% lower than the U.S. average, or higher rather, and the minimum wage is 7.25 cents an hour. A 2022 poll shows that state priorities included education, crime, abortion access, inflation, and high taxes. Makes sense. That's what people all over the country care about. It seems, however, that policing gender identity didn't rank anywhere on that list. Now, in Texas, Greg Abbott is quite literally taking the choice away from Texas citizens. He has directed state agencies to ban TikTok on campus Wi-Fi networks. I guess you will watch what Big Brother Abbott tells you to watch. What is this logic? Well, it's apparently that to protect you from Chinese influence on TikTok, America has to become as restrictive and authoritarian as China. I mean, okay. In Mississippi, Republicans have introduced House Bill 278, which would require cameras to be installed in classrooms, including post-secondary education institutions. Meaning, whatever you think about whether or not young kids should be observed, adults in college and grad school would be surveilled. As one lawyer put it, taxpayer surveillance of adults, not exactly the founding fathers' dream. And in Louisiana, while you can still technically watch adult videos, you now have to show your government ID for the privilege. I hope you trust the nanny state with the contents of your For Me page. Now, I get it. Wokeness can be annoying. Will and Grace and RuPaul really seem to have traumatized a generation. But while Democrats might have won some aspects of the culture war, with respect to gay rights, marriage equality, and basic racial equality all over the country, some Republican extremists are using legislation to force their beliefs upon the public. Using the law. They couldn't win the battle of ideas, apparently, so now they're using our legal system to strip Americans of their ability to choose what they wear, what they watch, and how they represent themselves. You have to ask yourself, how far is this going to go? A Pennsylvania school district has banned pride flags. Will other flags be banned? Canadian flags? Confederate flags? Blue Lives Matter flags? Prisoner of war flags? What governmental bureau of acceptable flag waving will decide what banners the censured citizens of Doylestown, Pennsylvania are allowed to wave? A West Virginia law, SB 252, would make it illegal for a parent named Caitlin Burns to even travel with their kids in the state of West Virginia because her status as a trans woman is considered, quote, obscene under the law. The penalty for this woman being near her children, a 5-year prison term and a $25,000 fine. And while so much of the concern about trans issues has been focused on the idea that children, due to their young developing brains, should be protected from from undue influence or from making big, consequential medical decisions, both the rhetoric here and the laws are increasingly criminalizing parents of trans children, adult behavior, as well as medical professionals who provide gender-affirming care to adults. Just as was the case during the, let's say, Afghanistan withdrawal and so many other moments in history, won't somebody think of the children as being used as a pretext to justify behavior that ordinary Americans in ordinary circumstances would never accept? A foundational principle of conservatism or libertarianism, I thought, was to allow adults to make their own choices. But despite foregrounding freedom in their rhetoric and framing woke culture wars over cups and ovens as restrictions on foundational rights, some Republican lawmakers have been working overtime to actually impose their will on the public rather than simply convince them through the war of ideas. I don't think anyone should take your gas oven, to be clear. And the good news is no one's going to. Like so many viral news stories, this is a nothing burger dreamed up to distract us from the high cost of living, low wages, big tech overreach, congressmen's insider trading, the rich getting richer, and legislators rigging the IRS so that rich people will never have to pay a fair share. Even if you don't quite get what all the fuss is about with respect to trans folks, even if you think drag shows are weird or even prurient, consider what it means to give the government more and more power to police how we live, how we parent, how we consume media, and to surveil our everyday lives. Surely you've heard Martin Niemöller's warning. First they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. How many communities will have to fall before you're worried enough about what it means for you? So yeah, Robbie, I've been really disturbed by the real wave of restrictions, legislative restrictions that have been coming down the pike, even just in the last month or two. Many of them actually passed into law and successful. This pornography bill in Louisiana, which we've alluded to several times in the show, is really kind of galling. And I expect there to be some significant legal backlash.
See what this is about.
Brianna, what's on your radar?
Well, Robbie, it looks like the elite's contempt for the poor has reached new heights this week. The Lever, first up, reported that billionaires are trying to use the legal system to suppress speech critical of their billionaire campaign spending. As we all know, Citizens United basically enabled the rich to write a blank political check, undermining the principle of one man, one vote by buying elections and even purchasing media outlets in an effort to make their truth the truth. Now they want to make it illegal to even criticize their corruption. Gas mogul Kelsey Warren is suing professional candidate Beto O'Rourke, arguing that he suffered, quote, mental anguish from comments, ads, and social media posts in which O'Rourke suggested that Warren contributed to Governor Greg Abbott's campaign as a reward for Abbott letting Warren's pipeline company off the hook following a deadly storm which left 4 million people without power. The Lever reports that Warren paid Abbott's campaign just 2 weeks after the governor signed legislation that included a loophole, allowing natural gas companies like Warren's to opt out of energy infrastructure winterization mandates that might have prevented the power shutdown. Beto O'Rourke described this as a case of bribery and corruption that resulted in the deaths of Texans. Perhaps a reasonable conclusion to draw given the timeline of events. However, Warren apparently wasn't satisfied with just having the power to buy favorable legislation. He wants to silence speech that will call him out for his corrupt behavior. Perhaps not so coincidentally, 4 years ago, Abbott signed legislation that weakened a state law that protected ordinary citizens against defamation suits from wealthy and corporate plaintiffs seeking to silence critics. And this is nothing new. The billionaires have been using these so-called slap lawsuits to intimidate critics for years. For example, in 2017, a West Virginia coal tycoon filed a case against John Oliver and HBO for discussing bad business practices that led to a mine collapse and 9 worker deaths. So much for free speech. Now, when billionaires aren't trying to use the courts to claim permanent victim status for themselves, media figures seem to be doing it for them. In a stunning clip on Fox earlier this week, Sean Hannity went on an unprovoked gushing session about how much better rich people are than poor people. Take a listen.
The years when I needed jobs, and I never got hired by a poor person in my life. I got hired by people that could afford to pay me. 2 characteristics. Every wealthy person I've ever met in my life, they have 2 qualities that are consistent. 1 is they're smart, and 2, they're hardworking.
I don't know who the audience is for this. Sean Hannity has a reported net worth of $300 million. He earns a salary of $40 million from his talk show and podcast and $25 million per year from his Fox News contract. So maybe he's simply forgotten that the average American earns less than $75,000 a year and is a wage earner, not a business owner. Or as failed presidential candidate Mitt Romney once called them, they're takers, not makers. Now, Romney paid the political price for being so dismissive of the hard-working American men and women who bring people like Hannity their dry cleaning, service their cars, shovel their driveways, and deliver their Amazon packages. But apparently, there's some portion of the cable news audience that likes being told that they're not rich because they're dumb and lazy. Or maybe real working people don't actually have time to sit around listening to Hannity in the first place. Listen to him lecture them from his comfortable news desk, gesticulating with his beautiful, smooth, soft hands, not a hair out of place. But look, Hannity's far from the only media elite showing contempt for working people this week. Candace Owens, while discussing the ongoing feud between Steve Crowder and the parent company that hosts both Owens and Crowder's shows, argued that multimillionaire Crowder was a socialist because he made demands of his boss. Look, the logic is tortured, but my concern here is not the criticism of Crowder. Have at him. That's between y'all. But about how workers somehow caught astray in all of this. Listen to the contempt with which Candace Owens speaks about workers in this clip.
You don't get to step in like a socialist, and it is socialist-like. These are the demands that you hear when people are trying to establish a union. When the Amazon workers have walked out because they have decided that they are worth more, that they should have 3-hour lunch breaks. They've gotten their contract from Amazon, and they realize that their lunch breaks are only 1 hour, and that they're required to show up to work, and they think they should be able to work from home for 3 days a week post-COVID, and they walk out, and they want to stage a union, and this is the big con, it's Amazon. No, this is the free markets.
Yeah, Amazon workers, they were protesting because they wanted 3-hour lunch breaks and the ability to package packages from home. You're sure that's why they went on strike. Look, a quick reminder, Amazon workers' complaints included that the company's work quotas were so strict that they were forced to pee in bottles to save time. One worker named Christy Schramm documented multiple urinary tract infections caused by holding her bladder for too long. You have to hold your pee or not make your rate, she said. Which one do you want to do? I had to make my rate. Another complaint centered on an Amazon worker who had a seizure on the job due to tough conditions, while another worker died of a heart attack and was then left on the work floor for 20 minutes before receiving treatment. There have also been reports of delivery drivers passing out in triple-digit weather, illegal union busting activity, and workers wearing diapers in order to compensate for the lack of bathroom breaks. But, you know, we live in a media climate so hostile populist media figure feels comfortable diminishing the real struggles of ordinary workers, tossing off a comment about how their labor struggle amounts to wanting a bougie 3-hour lunch break and the ability to work from home. I'm not sure where she got that. Projection, maybe? I'd hate to hear her take on, say, the railroad labor strike, but don't worry, I did a quick Google, and while I could be wrong, it seems like that wasn't an important enough story for her to ever mention. Not even once. In some positive class war news, there is some bipartisan interest in making Social Security solvent by raising the taxable wage gap. What does that mean? Well, because the rich own our government, they've rigged the system so that they pay much less into Social Security as a proportion of their income than you do. Wages are only taxable for the purposes of Social Security up to about $160,000 a year, so someone making, say, $500,000 or $1 billion is paying the same into the system as someone who's making $160K. This is clearly regressive and puts a disproportionate burden on working people. Even Democratic Party bête noir Joe Manchin is into this plan. Additionally, Republican Senator Bill Cassidy and Independent Senator Angus King have a plan to create an investment fund that would earn profits, which in turn would fund Social Security benefits, would basically capitalize on the higher returns you get from the stock market, and it has the thumbs up from lefty policy wonks like Matt Bruenig, as well as bipartisan backing. So what's the rub? Well, this is a radar about how the rich are openly fighting a class war against the poor and working class. But poor and working and middle class people have been so indoctrinated to admire and protect the rich, to think that they're better than us, that honestly, we often don't fight back, rarely advocating for these types of policies, calling our Congress members or holding them accountable at the polls when they scrap good common sense plans like these. What does it mean when media figures that hold the public trust can get away with minimizing labor concerns like wanting the basic right to go to the bathroom as a bourgeois peccadillo, when journalists with over $250,000 in assets lecture their middle-class viewers about how much better their class is than yours, and do so with impunity? Liberals do this too, by the way. When the Bernie campaign ended, liberals photoshopped me as a sanitation worker and a fast food employee in an attempt to, I guess, denigrate me, showing instead how little they thought of those hardworking professions. And that's coming from the historical Labor Party, the Democrats. That being the case, it strikes me that a world in which these things happen without consequence is a world where politicians know they can get away with abusing the 99% to their heart's content. And that makes me sad because, controversial take perhaps, the rich aren't actually better than the rest of us. So, who's going to tell them? You know, this is an ongoing frustration of mine. It feels like there is this fundamental accountability gap. And when I see the way that poor people are talked about, working class people, middle class people are talked down to, by people who literally need working class viewers, middle class viewers to stay rich, to stay in business, it is a real kind of revelation about how much impunity exists among the 1% to treat everybody else like trash.
Yeah, and while I'm sure I would disagree with some of the policies you would recommend to solve this issue, I am interested in what you're talking about with respect to Social Security, which is a huge problem. And Social Security now is I mean, it's a transfer. It's designed to be a transfer of wealth from younger people to older people. You know, the idea being at the end of your life, you need
you're from your younger self to your older self.
Right, but the issue is we're not putting as much in as people take out at the end, and also now we live in a society where the elderly are the wealthiest cohort in all of society. Wealth is now concentrated. Obviously, there are poor elderly people as well. There are elderly people who, what can you do with it? You know, they need help. They have no way to support themselves. They need medical care. But on a historical timeline, we have concentrated a lot more wealth in older people. I mean, it's older people have a lot of political power. Yeah. They're literally staffing our government at the highest levels in ways they have not ever before in American history. Whereas young people have had to, you know, try to find jobs during the Great Recession or the COVID economy, or have faced this tremendous economic insecurity and have to pay into Social Security. which they're and with a lot of questions about whether they're going to see any of those returns. So I think it's a huge problem where people like me who don't want to fund a social welfare system if it's going to help already the better off people in society, and people on the left who have maybe want a different version of a social welfare system that is actually taking care of people who need it.
Let's not do a category error here. Just because older people are wealthier, I mean, there's reasons for that. If you have done what society tells you to do, you've saved, and even modestly paid people should have a bolus of wealth at the end of their life to live on, for retirement. That's the whole point of saving for retirement. You have been saving your entire life. Of course, you're going to have more money. Moreover, we have all seen all the statistics about how there's these generational shifts where we just don't, our generation has not lived through the same economy as the boomers have lived through, and there are consequences for that. Home ownership as a vehicle for aggregating wealth is completely out the window for our generation. If you bought a house in Brooklyn in 1986, God bless you, you won the lottery, but that doesn't exist for us these days. And we should be clear that 45% of single retirees rely on Social Security for over 90% of their income. There are huge swaths of the elderly population that, but for Social Security, really would be living in the street, as Donald Trump warned us about in 2016. And there's a reason why Social Security was such a popular program when it became implemented in the first place. We really did have a situation where we had a class of elderly poor that I think nobody wants to return to. So thank God there are these plans to make Social Security solvent. The question is whether or not there's going to be any genuine appetite for them, despite the fact that they have bipartisan support.
Well, I certainly don't want to ask younger people to pay even more of their. I mean, it's so much. It's harder for younger people to get started with all the education issues we talk about.
Sure.
All the money you feel like you have to at least take out in order to afford an education to be a viable member of the workforce that they didn't have to deal with 30 years ago or 50 years ago.
Absolutely, but I also don't want to be living on the street when I'm old. We're all old eventually, Robbie, and I don't think that scrapping those kinds of programs for kind of a short-term goals is.
We're all old eventually, but people are. Some young people are living on the street too,
yeah.
and others are having a really hard time making ends meet because I feel like there's a generational transfer of wealth taking place.
There's not just a generational transfer of wealth. I mean, that's completely right. There is also an unprecedented concentration of wealth that's happening at the very, very top. I talked about this in a radar last week. That new Oxfam study that showed that. What was it, 50%, some ungodly amount of all of the new wealth generated in the last 2 years has gone to the top tiny sliver of a fraction of human beings on the planet. And people are working hard. The issue isn't that people aren't earning that money, that productivity isn't, yielding results, is that all of that money is being aggregated at the very, very top in a way that is causing social safety net programs to go insolvent, people to not be able to pay for housing, loans, support their kids, buy eggs. This is a real phenomenon. So I think the issue is not that there's not enough money to go around, it's whether or not we design social policy in a way to make sure that only a few people get it. And per my radar, I think we know why that might be the case, given who's running our government and how much contempt they have for the ordinary American.
Well, I feel like we can keep going at this a little bit, but we have more Rising to bring you right after this. Stay with us.
Most Americans, I'm going to talk about an angle to this that the mainstream media regrettably leaves out. Look, I get it. The scripts are predictable. On one hand, Democrats argue that the Republicans use the debt ceiling crisis to use as an excuse to cut popular social programs under the guise of fiscal responsibility. Democrats point out accurately that conservative opposition to raising the debt ceiling isn't really ideological for several reasons. For one, Republicans have no issue voting to raise the debt ceiling under Republican administrations. It was raised 18 times under Ronald Reagan, 8 times under Bush 1, 11 times under Bush 2. Moreover, conservative concern about the national debt comes off as bad faith when conservatives have statistically added more to the national debt than their Democratic counterparts. Bill Clinton was the last president to preside over a balanced budget, and statistically, Republicans add between 0.75% and 1.2% more to the deficit as a percentage of GDP each year compared to Democrats. Okay, part of the reason is spending sprees like Trump's tax cuts, which will add $1.9 trillion to the deficit over 11 years, while its benefits accrue disproportionately to the wealthiest 1% of Americans. Now, in response, some Republicans and conservative Democrats like Joe Manchin argue that fiscal responsibility demands that we pay for what we spend. Fair enough. Still others, like Donald Trump, are honest, transparent, shall we say, about the fact that this isn't really about fiscal responsibility. Trump described the debt ceiling as a bargaining chip that can be used to reverse policies passed by Democrats, no matter how popular or necessary those policies are. Again, points for honesty, but let's not forget that Trump increased or suspended the debt 3 times while president, and the national debt swelled to nearly $8 trillion during his tenure at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. But here's where my take might surprise you. I actually agree in part with the fiscal conservatives who point out that the national debt is a problem. We've just arrived at this conclusion for different reasons, and of course I have a very different solution for solving this problem. Now first, let's get into the problem. Look at this chart showing the national debt growth since 1922. Oof, what's driving all of those bumps and exponential spikes? Well, there have been significant spikes during our self-funded wars, the First Revolutionary War, and then, as you can see on the chart, World War II. But the Afghanistan and Iraq wars, there at the end, are correlated with the exponential spike you see around the 2002 mark, as did the 2008 recession and the COVID pandemic. And now, U.S. contributions to the war in Ukraine continue to fuel the debt crisis. If wars have been driving this crisis for so long, why does it seem like Washington politicians never suggest cuts to the military budget to rein in their debt? Well, conservatives regularly argue that the solution lies in cutting social safety net programs, like Social Security. But one glance at U.S. spending shows where the easy pickings really are. And it's not grandma's Social Security check, which she paid into her entire life and earned. It's our ballooning military budget, which comprises about 54%